Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, and I'm here to answer your questions about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, J.R. Tolkien's other works, and J.R.R. Tolkien himself. And I have to say, I've been enjoying the YouTube content, making and sharing it. The last video has done really well. I definitely saw a little bit of a bump. First video on the channel to reach 100 views, which is exciting. So if you like what you see, definitely help me out here. Subscribe, hit the bell, leave me some comments. That really helps with the algorithm. Maybe hit a thumbs up too. So anyway, we have a lot to get through this week. There were way too many questions that were really good, so it was hard to pare it down to 15, so I didn't. I pared it down to 18. So let's start with this first question, which was submitted anonymously, and this person asks... Oh, wait, and before I get into that, actually, to submit a question, just look in the description. There's a link to my Quora account. That's where you can submit questions. You can submit questions if you want me to answer in the comments as well, and I will reply to as many comments as I can, of course. But if you want them to be featured in a video, I will definitely answer them on Quora as long as they're good questions, but the very best ones I will, of course, feature in videos. So here's the first question. How were Frodo and Sam able to walk so many miles with heavy packs on their backs, considering they were only 3 feet in height? So there's actually a lot of things at play here, but I think the main thing that I need to address here is the assumption that because hobbits are small of height, it makes them weak in some way, and that's just not the case. I mean, we see it so many times over throughout The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Hobbits are very tough and much stronger than anyone would really think who didn't know them well. Now, since you're talking about Frodo and Sam specifically, we have to assume you're talking about them walking through Mordor, walking to Mordor and walking through Mordor. So here's a few things to consider. First off, Sam especially is in really good shape. He's an outdoorsman. He works outdoors in a garden all day with his hands. He's no stranger to labor, and he always carried the heaviest burden. His pack was always the heaviest, and that was by choice. He didn't care if it was fair or not. He always carried more, probably just because he could. And certainly he was very good at lightening the load for Frodo. He's also just this blue-collar guy who didn't come from like a rich family like Frodo, Merry, and Pippin, so he wasn't probably eating lavish meals all the time. You know, he probably was more of a, quick meat and potatoes guy, so he was probably in really good shape. Frodo was just burning on pure willpower. That's the second thing we got to talk about. He goes forward because he has to. He basically walks himself near to death. The third thing you have to consider is the lembas bread. Now, the lembas bread, the elven way bread, it may not make you feel full, but it gives you a strength and endurance of many meals. A little bit of lembas bread could have you going all day. And it was said, not in The Lord of the Rings, but actually in one of the stories in Unfinished Tales of the Coming of Tuor to Gondolin, it spoke of the way bread and how if you eat it with other food, you're not actually getting the full effect. But if you eat only the lembas bread, only the way bread, it has a greater effect. So when they ran out of food and they were sustaining themselves on only lembas, they were able to go further than you might think. The fourth thing to talk about is their packs weren't really as heavy as you might think because they were running out of food. And there was a point where they were just so exhausted and weighed down, they got rid of the orcish armor, keeping only the cloaks, and they cast out anything that they didn't need, because there was a point where Frodo and Sam thought, this is the end of our lives. We're going to get to Mount Doom and hopefully destroy the One Ring. There is no hope of ever going home. We have lost any hope that we ever had that we're going to make it back to the Shire. So why are we carrying all this stuff? So they threw it all in a ravine, including Sam's cooking gear, because they figured this was the end, that they were going to succeed perhaps, but they were going to die in doing so. And the last thing is that there was absolutely a bit of divine intervention involved. There was a point near the slopes of Mount Doom. Frodo and Sam were exhausted. They were unable to move. They were resting. And then Sam, he had been sort of the focal character for quite some time throughout Book 6. And he just felt something within him. He felt a call, a sudden sense of urgency that he must get up and that he must move at that moment. And he got up and he saw that Frodo had also gotten up, and he realized Frodo had also gotten this call. You could say it's the Valar. You could say it's Iluvatar. Either way, because of the timing, and we actually spoke about this, I believe it was last week or it may have been 2 weeks ago, about the timing of everything had to be so exact because of what was going on, at the Black Gate. They couldn't tarry any longer. Not to mention Gollum was lurking nearby. So there's a lot of factors, including just the fact that you're underestimating hobbits. Just because they're 3 feet tall does not mean that they are weak in any way. They had many reasons and many factors that just caused them to trudge forward. Okay, so the next question, this is also an anonymous question. Did the Valar limit the powers of the Astari directly, as in some form of capacitor, or was their use of power up to their discretion? For instance, it seems Gandalf would require his full power to match Durin's Bane. Was Saruman's power limited? I believe that it was partly just a mandate, that they were told not to use their full power, right? But that they could call upon their full power if there was a need to, such as Gandalf fighting the Balrog. However, there is another aspect to the limit, not quite like a capacitor like you brought up, but aside from this mandate, the wizards are incarnates. And to understand what an incarnate is, you have to understand sort of the true nature of the wizards or the Istari. All of them were Ainur, which are powerful spirits that we would call angels. And they're of the same kind as the Valar, but of a lesser degree of power. And, the spirit is their true form. Any physical shape that an Ainur takes is a raiment. It's like clothing. It gives them what Tolkien called shape and hue. It's a manifestation of their will. A good example of this, Sauron. He's a shapeshifter. He could take any shape that he could think of to a point. He lost a lot of that power in the Second Age, but it's like he's changing clothes, right? He's not changing his form, but changing the manifestation of his will that he presents to you that gives him shape and hue. Now, with incarnates, it's a little different. The wizards are actually in real bodies. They are not physical manifestations of their will. They're actual bodies. They exist. They function just the same as any human body does. They age, although they age slowly. They could be hurt. They could feel pain. They have real emotions, human emotions. They had emotions before, but now they have human emotions. They also need food and water. They need sustenance to keep themselves going. They need to sleep. They grow tired. This is the limit that was placed on them. How much magic could their bodies handle? Now, they got around this a little bit because they used staves. The rods of the 5 wizards. That's what Saruman called it, right? Bilbo called it a wand. It's Gandalf's staff or Saruman's staff or whatever. We don't really know the full function of these staves, but they seem to channel their magic, which might lessen the burden on their bodies. But they are still made out of wood, right? They're real branches cut into a shape. So they could only take so much. So when Gandalf faced the Balrog, he used his staff to break the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and that was too much for the staff to bear, and the staff shattered. So there was a limit to it. And though Gandalf did kill the Balrog, it was after 11 days of full combat and pursuit with no rest. It was the limit for his body, and that's why his body perished. So the mandate of the Valar, circling back to that, is to not use power against power when it comes to Sauron, right? However, the Balrog was not affiliated with Sauron. It was a completely separate evil that presented itself. So there's no doubt that Gandalf had the authority to use his full power against the Balrog, but the limit placed on him by being an incarnate, by being in a real physical body, was the reason that it was so difficult. I mean, he even said at the beginning, a Balrog, and I am already weary. So I hope that's a good answer for you. Okay, next question. In The Lord of the Rings, why does the One Ring cause invisibility? So the One Ring causes invisibility as sort of a byproduct of what it's actually doing, which is an unintended side effect. Sauron didn't think of this when he created the ring, because he never intended for anybody but him to ever wear the ring. That was beyond the purview of what he was thinking. When the One Ring is worn by Sauron, he doesn't vanish, but when it's worn by Smeagol, Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Isildur, they vanish. This is due to the fact that they are being drawn into a spirit realm, what Tolkien called the Wraith World. It doesn't affect Sauron because he is a spirit, and we just talked about this. He exists in both realms, and what you're seeing is his raiment, a manifestation of his will. It doesn't affect Tom Bombadil. That's for an unknown reason, because we really don't know the nature of Bombadil. We don't know what he is. We can make theories. We could think that perhaps he is also a spirit, or perhaps he is not affected by the magic of Middle-earth because he is not native to Middle-earth. It could be a lot of different things, right? But it doesn't affect him. As a matter of fact, he was able to reverse the power of the ring and make the ring vanish. Now, I should also note that when you wear the ring, you're not actually fully invisible. It's just that most people can't perceive the spirit realm. But for those who can, for example, the Nazgul, you're perfectly visible, right? As a matter of fact, for wraiths, they see you better when you're drawn into the spirit realm, when you because you're in the same realm as them. They see most people as sort of like dark shadows, and now they're seeing you, as you are. Also, it was mentioned in The Hobbit that Bilbo, when he wore the ring, was not... He was like almost invisible, right? It was mentioned that in very direct sunlight, or very strong light, like direct sunlight, you could see sort of a pale shadow, like a shimmering, that would indicate that's where he was. Maybe this is because the spirit realm, the Wraith world, is partially visible, just a little bit, but very hard to perceive, and needs a lot of light to see it even slightly. So, in short, the One Ring is bringing you to a spirit realm, and most people can't see the spirit realm, or it's incredibly difficult to see, which is why you appear to vanish, why you become invisible. Okay. All right, next question. Has anybody ever killed a Balrog without dying in Middle-earth? Not in the published canon works of J.R.R. Tolkien, what we call the Legendarium. There were older drafts which you could read a lot of that in the series The History of Middle-earth, and that would happen often, actually, but because originally, and I don't mean originally like back in the day, and then they changed, but Tolkien's original idea was that Balrogs were sort of these tough, powerful creatures that were just like commanders, important beasts. There were a lot of them in Morgoth's army. Or they weren't. He wasn't even called Morgoth in these early drafts. He was called Melko, which became Melkor, and then it turned out that Melkor was what the elves called him. But anyway, the elves would sometimes manage to kill Balrogs. It was not easy, but they did it a lot of times without dying. In the earliest draft of the story, The Fall of Gondolin, Tuor killed 5 Balrogs, and he didn't die. So later on in the writing, not later on in the story, later on in the writing, Balrogs became fallen Maiar, right? Tolkien had the idea to make them angels. fallen angels, of course, and they were much more powerful, and there weren't quite so many of them. Tuor didn't fight any Balrogs. He certainly didn't kill any Balrogs. How many were there? At least 5, no more than 7. It's generally, most fans generally accept that there's 7 Balrogs because Tolkien said at least 5, no more than 7. There could have been 6 for all we know, but they're not all like named or anything. But no more than 7 Balrogs ever. So, because they became so much more powerful, killing them would always come at a great price. And so we saw that Ecthelion died, and Glorfindel died, and Gandalf died. So there you have it. But of course we have 2 elves and a Maya, and elves don't really die, they go home. Gandalf came back, so, it's at a heavy price, but it's not a permanent price, we'll say. All right, next question. Who would win between Sauron and Fingolfin? So, I don't always like to comment on sort of these, like who would win in a fight questions, because I think it runs a little counter to the way that Tolkien viewed things. But I think that the important takeaway here is that Sauron is very smart, and he would know to not fight Fingolfin, because he would lose. Fingolfin may have lost to Morgoth, but it was only because Morgoth is incapable of dying. Right, the only way that he would die is in the final battle, the final battle, the Battle of Battles, Dagor-Dagorath, where he would be slain by Turin Taranbar, right? But that's a story that never got told. Morgoth, as he was in the Silmarillion, cannot actually die, so no matter how many times Fingolfin gave him a wound that would be fatal to just about anybody else, he stayed alive. The only reason that Fingolfin loses is because eventually he just gets tired, weary. He was dodging Morgoth's blows, and eventually he tired out. Morgoth pinned him down and killed him. Fingolfin was practically a force of nature. When he rode out to fight Morgoth, his eyes shone not like an elf, but like the Valar. And those that saw him in his full wrath thought he was an incarnate of the Valar Oroma, the huntsman of the Valar. Sauron didn't usually fare well in direct combat, right? That was not the way that he did things. His path to victory against someone as insanely overpowered as Fingolfin would be magic. He defeated Finrod in this way. Through song, with the song of the Ainur, his magic. If it came to combat, Fingolfin would tear Sauron apart. Sauron, of course, wouldn't die any more than Morgoth did, but he would lose his body. His naked spirit would be forced to flee. If Sauron was prepared, though, he would probably lay some sort of trap for Fingolfin. He would use magic. He would be able to contain Fingolfin and maybe kill him. But if it came down to direct combat, Fingolfin wins, and Sauron's usually smart enough not to get into direct combat with powerful elves, So there you go. Okay, next question. This is a quick one. Why did Smaug... What did Smaug eat when he was occupied the Lonely Mountain? Did he go out and eat the people of Dale? It's actually a pretty good question. We don't know much about the nature of dragons in Tolkien's universe. We do have to assume that they must eat, right? I think the incorrect assumption that a lot of people make is that he never left the mountain, right? He probably did from time to time go out, and I think he probably predated on wild animals. I think if he was going to Esgaroth, you would have heard of them. There were no people in Dale, right? They were all driven out or killed. So if he was, going to the nearest settlement, which was Esgaroth, that had people in it, you would have heard about that. They hadn't seen the dragon for a long time. So he probably went out and ate wild animals. He certainly ate the ponies that Bilbo and Thorin got from the Men of Esgaroth and brought there. So that's probably what was going on. Okay, next question. Most of these are actually anonymous. I'll tell you if the person's name is on there. But this person asks, are the ring wraiths ghosts, or are they still living beings but barely human in Middle Earth? They're undead. Not exactly ghosts. I mean, ghosts is a pretty good description. I could split hairs and say they're not ghosts, but they're not quite alive. They're undead. Their lives have been extended. They were men, and their lives are extended far beyond normal means by the rings of power. And their bodies have basically died, withered. They're gone. That's why they don't have substance. They don't have what Tolkien would refer to as shape and hue. Their souls are still there. Their spirits are still there, and they're bound to Sauron and his ruling ring. Essentially, they have died in a sense because their bodies died, but they were denied the gift of man, also known as the doom of man. They cannot pass from the world because they're bound to it. They're bound to the One Ring. Only once the One Ring is destroyed are they released from this, and they can pass from the world, or in the case of the Witch King, the enchantments that bound him were destroyed when Mary stabbed him in the leg with an enchanted dagger, and then Eowyn was able to get an actual killing blow on the Witch King. So he was already gone, and the rest of them passed from Arda after the One Ring was destroyed. So ghosts, I mean, you could say it's a fairly accurate statement to say they're ghosts. They're not exactly intangible, because ghosts don't work that way in Tolkien's universe. They are souls that were denied a path to the afterlife, in a way. So they're sort of stuck, right? Okay. Next question, and this one asks, this is another quick one. What was Melkor's true form in The Lord of the Rings? Well, we kind of already talked about this, because Melkor is a Valar, and his true form is a spirit. He would not have, as I said, shape and hue. After the creation of Arda and Ea, which is the universe, all of the Valar took shape and hue after the creation of Ilúvatar's children. They looked upon Ilúvatar's children, and they made themselves look like that. So they basically looked like elves, more or less. Before destroying the two trees, Melkor took another form, that of a great dark lord. And he never changed his form after that. He was I wouldn't say he was stuck, but he decided to stick with the Morgoth, the big armored guy, right? His true form, of course, was still a spirit. This was just his clothes, so to speak, his raiment, the manifestation of his will to give himself shape and hue. Okay. A lot of these are related. That's why I'm able to roll through them faster. Okay, here's another question. Did J.R.R. Tolkien ever explain why there were no children in The Lord of the Rings? Well, there were children. They just weren't usually important characters, right? The most prominent child character in The Lord of the Rings would be Burgle, who was the son of Beregond. He was the captain of the Watch at Minas Tirith. He showed Pippin around Minas Tirith, and they became friends. At first, Burgle thought Pippin was a child his age, and he boastfully claimed that he could probably beat Pippin up. They got into kind of a silly argument. They almost got into a fight, and then Pippin told him, "Hey, kind of relax. I'm not here to fight. I'm here as a friend." And he told him that he was 28 years old, but that in the Shire he is still considered a boy. So Pippin is also a child, so to speak. He's more akin to a human teenager, right? So there are other children that are not as important, but the fact is The Lord of the Rings is a story of war, and children are usually kept away from war. Now, at Helm's Deep, Gamling noted that there were several children defending the keep. I believe the line was, "There are many here who have not seen enough summers, or those who, like me, have seen too many." So, there are children in The Lord of the Rings. In The Hobbit, less so, because that's, Bilbo and the dwarves going through the wild mostly, but, they don't really run into any children. But The Lord of the Rings certainly has children. They're just not all that important. Okay, next question. If the Númenóreans knew that Sauron was evil and deceiving, why did they decide to take Sauron back to Númenor and rather not any of the colonies of Middle-earth at the time. If Sauron was well known as a deceiver and a seducer, he wouldn't be very good at his job, now would he? Remember that Sauron surrendered, and Pharazon, the king of Numenor, was very prideful. He's prideful and vain, and he thought he had completely conquered and dominated one of the Maya, and one that had terrorized Middle-earth since the First Age. So bringing him back to Middle-earth, but bring him back from Middle-earth is what I meant to say, would prove his might and his greatness, the greatness of Pharazon, that he was a mighty king who went to Middle-earth and captured Sauron, right? Got him to surrender. He wouldn't think that Sauron's playing him because he doesn't think of himself as the type of person who could be played in that way. That's how Sauron operates. He took advantage of Pharazon's vanity and pride. Okay, so this next question was asked by William Alexander. Was the One Ring's true purpose in The Lord of the Rings to be like a horcrux in Harry Potter? If Saruman's body was killed, only Eru Ilúvatar could restore it. Unlikely. So the ring anchored Sauron's spirit to Arda and to keep going. No. There's a few assumptions here that are false. The biggest one is that only Eru Ilúvatar could restore Sauron's body. That's actually not true. Sauron was a shapeshifter, and he was a spirit. We talked about this earlier, so I'm glad I'm, addressing a lot of the same things here. His body is a raiment. It's a manifestation of his will. It's like clothes to his naked spirit. He can and will, on occasion, lose his body or even just abandon his body altogether and then regenerate a new body. Now, it became somewhat limited. It was hinted in the Silmarillion that it would take some time for Sauron to regenerate a new body if he abandoned the one that he had. After Huan, who was the Hound of Valinor, grabbed Sauron by the throat. He couldn't get free. He tried to shapeshift several times to get free, and he just couldn't do it. So Luthien was there, and she told him if he abandoned his body, he must go back to his master Morgoth as a naked spirit, defeated, and he would be subject to Morgoth's scorn. So Sauron knew that this was true, and he relented. He surrendered. Sauron's body was completely destroyed in the Second Age in an event called the Akalabeth, but he managed to rebuild one for himself, though it was limited because he is so hurt by the Akalabeth that he could no longer adopt a fair form. He lost his body again after the One Ring was severed from him, but he did regain a new body by the end of the Third Age. We know that he physically tortured Gollum, who described Sauron what he looked like. He was blackened and burnt and had a missing finger. So the One Ring contains part of his essence, what we might call his soul, but its purpose is not one of a soul jar or the more vulgar horcrux. He poured his soul into the ring because that's how magic works. You put a little bit of yourself into a magical creation. Blades forged in Gondolin, they burned like a blue light whenever they were around goblins or orcs, as they're also called, because the elves put a little bit of themselves into their craft, which was their hatred of the orcs. Evil exists because Melkor put himself, his essence, into the very fabric of reality, the planet, the universe. Because all of the Ainur, all of the angels, had a hand in creating the universe. But he put his own dark thoughts into it, and that's why evil exists. So the One Ring contains a great deal of Sauron's essence because he needed to do that for his spell to work, the spell that would bind all of the rings of power to one ruling ring. Sauron wasn't even aware of how low he would be brought if the One Ring was destroyed. For a while, he actually thought it had been destroyed, and he was building up his power slowly. And then he, of course, found out that the One Ring was not destroyed, and he very much wanted it back. It was a surprise to him to find out that it was still around and that it had been found. So, and it was a surprise to him too that when it was destroyed, that he lost all of his power, and he was brought so low that he could never regain power again. So Sauron did not need an implement to be immortal. He's eternal. He's an angel. And as an angel that had entered the world, he's already bound to it. He's already bound to the world. Okay. All right, next question, and this one was asked by Alice Stone. How did Peter Jackson manage to become director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy with such a relatively sparse prior filmography? So the road to Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings is an interesting one, and it sort of runs contrary to the way things normally work in Hollywood, the way that we're used to things going. You might think of it as, a studio got the rights to The Lord of the Rings, and then they chose Peter Jackson. And it seems strange because before that he had just mostly done horror films and not that many films in general. So why would a studio who has gained the rights to something like Lord of the Rings choose Peter Jackson of all people? So what actually happened was Peter Jackson in the 70s saw Ralph Bakshi's film, The Lord of the Rings. And he had not read the book. He was not a Tolkien reader, but he was into it in a way. He was interested in it, but he was confused by it. And if you've ever seen Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, it follows the book fairly well up to a point. And then it starts, it doesn't stop following the book, but it starts jumping around. It becomes a little confusing if you haven't read the book. Once the hobbits get to Rivendell, everything starts rushing forward, and there are a lot of things that get skipped. There were things before that got skipped too, but it became less coherent as it went on, is what I'm trying to say. It's easy to follow if you know the story, but if you don't know the story, like Peter Jackson, when he saw the film, it was confusing. But he was intrigued by it, so he wound up getting the books and reading them. And he became a Tolkien fan. So later on, he was a director who had done mostly horror films, but he wanted to do a fantasy picture. And he couldn't find any scripts that weren't blatantly ripping off Tolkien's work. So he thought, well, since everybody is wanting to do The Lord of the Rings, why don't we actually do The Lord of the Rings? So he sought out the rights. So he went to Harvey Weinstein at Miramax, and they purchased the rights to The Lord of the Rings. And they started shopping around to find a studio that would bankroll them, right? Because Weinstein was interested in producing it, but Miramax didn't want to do it if it was going to be more than one film. That was the issue. So Peter Jackson wanted to do 3 films. He wanted to do 1 film based on The Hobbit, and then 2 films based on The Lord of the Rings. And it didn't work out, partially because he found out that the rights that were purchased did not actually include The Hobbit, which is why The Hobbit came later. He found out that he only had The Lord of the Rings. And he was having an issue with his plan of making 2 films now, based on The Lord of the Rings. Miramax was only interested in a single film, and Harvey Weinstein told him, the only way you're going to get this done is if you do it as a single film. And Peter Jackson asked if it could be a long film, like 4 hours long. He said, no, it has to be 2 hours long. So can you imagine it would be just like the Ralph Bakshi film all over again, trying to rush through the whole story in 2 hours? Ralph Bakshi only got halfway through The Two Towers before the movie ended, and he never got to make that second film. Rankin and Bass wound up making The Return of the King. But even there, that was book 5 and 6. Book 4 never got made into a cartoon back then. So Peter Jackson was not willing to make a single film. He wanted to do two. Harvey Weinstein started being like, well, I'll find somebody who will make one film. But that was, according to Peter Jackson, it came off as sort of like an empty threat. So eventually he came to New Line Cinema. And this is where they said, we're not interested in 2 films. We're actually interested in 3. There are 3 books. Let's make 3 films. The concept of a trilogy was very, very attractive to New Line Cinema at the time. So that's how that happened. So it's not the usual story where the studio gets the rights and then they pick a director, where the director sought out the rights and then found a studio. So it sort of went backwards, but it worked out really well, of course. Okay. Next question. Why did Gandalf turn from the gray to the white? To put it really in the simplest terms possible, it was a promotion. There were 5 Istar. The Istari are the wizards. Or at least there were 5 that we knew of. There was the white, the gray, the brown, and the blue, which there were 2 of the blue. The colors were not just the colors of the robes that they wore, but it was like their station, their job. The white was the head of the order. And the concept of the white represented light, the goodness of Valinor. Even before the arrival of the wizards, there was the White Council, which was founded by Galadriel, and it was named so due to the concept of the white being light, the chiefest good. So, when Gandalf died, he passed beyond Arda to the Timeless Halls, where Eru Ilúvatar is. That's basically God. And he was sent back as the White. When he met the 3 hunters in Fangorn Forest, that's Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, they apologized to him for their initial attack because he was dressed in white. They had an encounter with an old man dressed in white that was almost certainly Saruman, just like the night before. They thought he was Saruman. And his reply was, "Indeed I am Saruman," one might say. Saruman as he should have been. Gandalf was promoted as Saruman had abandoned the white. Even literally, he called himself Saruman of many colors. So Gandalf he was more powerful, he was granted more authority, and he was the head of the order. And this is why he was able to dismiss Saruman from the order and break his staff, and why he wore the white robes. Okay. All right, next question, and this is a good question. Does Galadriel have a natural tendency towards evil? No, she's not evil, but she's prideful, and that was the issue that the Valar had with her. She needed to prove herself. Galadriel, like many of the elves in Middle-earth, is an exile. She's from the Noldor, and they became exiles after the first kinslaying, where Fëanor, he wished to travel to Middle-earth. He was going to pursue Morgoth, because Morgoth had destroyed the 2 trees of Valinor, and he stole the Silmarils. And Fëanor went to the Teleri, which was another group of elves, and he wanted to use their ships to travel from Aemon to Middle-earth. And that was actually forbidden. You weren't supposed to do that. The Teleri said no, and because Fëanor had taken an oath to slay anyone that got in his way, he was sort of like honor-bound to kill the Teleri. And that was what became the first kinslaying. There were actually 3 kinslayings, and they got worse from there. Now, not all of the Noldor elves that were exiles took part in the kinslaying. Some of them went to Middle-earth for other reasons. Fingolfin, for example, wanted to keep an eye on Fëanor. Glorfindel was going out of loyalty to I believe it was Turgon. Some of them, though, like Galadriel, just wished to see Middle-earth. And she wanted to found and rule a fair kingdom in Middle-earth. So, these elves that were not part of the kinslaying, they didn't go on stolen ships. They went across the horcrux, which is the part of the sea to the north that is frozen. They walked across. It took them 27 years. All right. Now, Galadriel, and many of these elves, but Galadriel is who we're talking about. She was blameless in the kinslaying, but she still did something that was forbidden. She traveled to Middle-earth, and she fell under the same exile and doom of Mandos that they all did. They didn't repent. they didn't return to Aemon. At the end of the first stage, after the War of Wrath, when Morgoth was defeated, almost all of the Noldor were forgiven and allowed to return if they wished. But there were specific elves that were singled out that were not forgiven, and Galadriel was one of them. The Valar felt that she had to prove something. She had been prideful. She came to Middle-earth specifically to rule something. She even accepted a ring of power later on, which just sort of played into it. She used this ring of power to keep her realm the way it was, to preserve it. How far would she go? How dark would Galadriel go to keep her realm? And then Frodo comes through with the One Ring and offers it freely to her. The exact words he said were something along the lines of, "I will give this to you if you ask it." Galadriel had to admit she did want the ring. If she was in an interesting position, because if Frodo failed his quest, Sauron gets the ring back, and then she can't use her ring anymore, and that makes her kingdom fall. And likely just be overrun by Sauron's forces. And that's the end of Lothlorien. If Frodo succeeds and destroys the One Ring, the power of all the rings of power fades, and her kingdom fades as well. It falls. It's a slower fall. It's not a violent fall, but it's still a fall nonetheless. She still loses her fair realm. It's still going to fade. So she's put into this position where it's a lose-lose. The only way to win is to take the ring, overthrow Sauron, right? And she's tempted. She absolutely is tempted. She's capable. She knows that she could master the One Ring, and she knows that with it she could defeat Sauron. But she also knows that she would be just as bad as Sauron at that point. She wouldn't accept the power because the power of the One Ring was wholly evil. And she knew that it was going to have an effect on her. She would become the third Dark Lord, so to speak. So, or maybe not even that. Maybe she'd become like Ainur, her uncle, who perpetuated the kinslayings, and she hated him. So when Galadriel rejected the ring, that actually is what gave her the grace that she was able to return to Valinor. She proved herself that she would rather be good than be queen. And that was why she said she passed the test, and she will pass to the west and remain Galadriel. Good question, though. Okay, so this next question asks, would the Valar have been upset with Legolas for bringing Gimli to the Undying Lands? Would they even let Gimli in? So the Valar got a little loose with their restrictions in the Fourth Age, right? They previously no mortals were allowed on pain of death, right? Tuor was the only mortal allowed. He became immortal by special grace of Eru Ilúvatar. By the time that Gimli sailed west with Legolas, they had already let in Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam. So the important thing to remember is that the Valar did not want mortals living in the Undying Lands. But Gimli, at that point, was 262 years old. He wasn't going to be living very long at all. Now, we don't know the exact circumstances by which Legolas and Gimli struck out west, just that they did. That Legolas built a ship, and they left, from one of the bays in Gondor, actually, and they went west. I personally would imagine that Gimli, being extremely aged, would just pointedly at some juncture say to Gimli, "I'm old." And Legolas would say, "Look, yeah, you are old. You're very old at this point." And he would say, "Look, I don't have long. 262 years is very old for a dwarf. Their life expectancy is 250, so he's already very long lived." And he probably said something along the lines of, "I don't have long to live." And Legolas would ask, "Well, what do you wish to do before you die?" And Gimli said, and this is the one thing we know, that he wanted to see Galadriel one last time. So, everything about it is sort of unusual. They didn't seek the Grey Havens at Lindon. they departed in a ship that Legolas made himself. Legolas may not have had the authority to bring a mortal to the Undying Lands, but here's the part where I point out that it's very likely that Legolas does not care. He's a Cinda. He has very little connection with the Undying Lands or with the Valar. He felt the urge, the sea longing, because he saw gulls during the War of the Ring. But he still stayed in Middle-earth for quite some time, and until he took Gimli with him. So, how did it happen, right? Well, you can only imagine, but the way that I would personally imagine it was Manwë, in his mansion at the top of the tallest mountain, sees this very strange sight. There's this small boat approaching with a Cinda elf and a dwarf making their way to Valinor, and he probably said something along the line, I mean, because he would have known who Gimli is, right? He probably would have said something along the lines of, by whose grace does he go? And I think it would have been, obviously Galadriel would want him there, right? But she doesn't really have, she's an elf, she doesn't really have the authority. I think it was Gandalf, probably, who spoke up and said, by my grace. And then they probably told Galadriel, hey, there's this dwarf coming, and he really wants to see you. And she probably met him on the shores of Erisea is where she wound up. So another thing to consider about this, though, is that dwarves believe that they go to Aemon when they die anyway, right? Thorin mentioned this in The Hobbit, that he would go to the Halls of Waiting, which we know as the Halls of Mandos, and to sit by his fathers until the world is remade. And that's the thing. In the prophecy of Dagor Diggeroth, Tolkien, one of the things that he mentioned was that the dwarves would become children of Ilúvatar. So then they would get an afterlife. They would pass from the world, right? Because they were mortal. But until then, they slumbered, in a sense, when they died. They waited. So, if you think about it, like elves and elves die, they just go home. They're immortal. They never really die, right? Humans and hobbits are mortals. They die and they pass from the world completely. Dwarves are mortals, but they're not Ilúvatar's children. They don't pass from the world. At least they don't believe that they do, but they kind of go into a purgatorial state in a way. So, and this is, a lot of this is conjecture because we don't, Tolkien didn't speak about afterlife so much. But we do know that the dwarves will one day become children of Ilúvatar, and since they are mortal, they will be able to pass from Arda completely. But as it is, even if Gimli had died in Middle-earth, he would have likely wound up in the Halls of Mandos. I don't know if he would have been conscious, is the thing, or if he would have been able to see Galadriel. That's just some food for thought, really. Okay, next question. What is the Westfold? Why did it fall, and why wasn't Gondor there? So, there's a line from a movie, Where Was Gondor When the Westfold Fell? The Westfold is the western part of Rohan, right? Just like the Shire has, like, the West Farthing is the west part, they have the Westfold. And that's where Theoden's son Theodred was the leader of the Westfold. He was in charge. And then he died, and a man called Erkenbrand became the Lord of the Westfold. And he attempted to hold the Westfold against Isengard's armies, but he was driven out, and he was believed lost. They thought he died. He turned out to be alive. Gandalf found him and brought him to Helm's Deep. With the remaining men of the Westfold. And that was one of the things that really turned the tide there at Helm's Deep. The movie put some, I think, unnecessary animosity between Rohan and Gondor, and it was for the sake of drama, really. Theoden seemed reluctant to aid Gondor because they didn't aid him, right? They didn't aid Rohan, so where were they when the Westfold burned? Now, there's no evidence that he called for aid. That's the thing. And when the official request from Gondor comes, which in the films was the beacons being lit, he immediately says Rohan will answer. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't make a big stink about the Westfold. So, you know, the initial reluctance was some drama that it was kind of pointless in hindsight, actually. In the book, it was like the opposite of that. He was itching to ride to Gondor. And when the request came, which in the book was a ceremonial red arrow brought to him by a man named Hirgon of Gondor, he basically said, "I'm already, we're going there." And but it was important though because they needed to hurry. They needed to move quickly. The beacons were actually in the book to alert other parts of Gondor to come to Minas Tirith. So the film did show Theodred dying, but Erkenbrand was left out of it, and his part in riding to Helm's Deep was actually taken by Éomer. In the book, Éomer was already at Helm's Deep. So the Westfold was just the area that Saruman had razed and destroyed, and that's why it fell. And Gondor wasn't there because nobody asked them to be there. There wasn't even enough time to ask Gondor, because Saruman just took everybody by surprise. Okay. All right, next question was asked by... Okay, so I actually spoke to this... So this is... I've been saying Howl Santos, and I actually spoke to him and asked him, how do you pronounce your name? Because I've put a few of your answers in my YouTube videos, and I don't know how to say your name. And he told me, well, it's basically the Portuguese equivalent of John, so just call me John. So this was submitted by John Santos, who asks, what happens to the dwarves in the Fourth Age? So the dwarves actually did really well for themselves in the Fourth Age. They... And if we're led to believe Dagor-Dagorath, the prophecy that I spoke of earlier, they did well after that as well. So it was in the Fourth Age that Durin the Seventh, the Last, was born as a son of Thorin the Third, Stonehelm. And he was the final iteration of Durin the Deathless. And he successfully reestablished Moria. He retook Khazad-dûm and reestablished the Dwarven nation, and it grew and prospered. Beyond this, we don't really know too much. We know that they made a colony in Rohan, near Helm's Deep in the Glittering Caves. That was founded by Gimli. And that they hunted the orcs of the north nearly to extinction. Now, if we believe the prophecy of Dagor-Dagorath, which may have been the event that closed out the Fourth Age, the reshaping of the world and the second music would make the dwarves, as I mentioned earlier, children of Iluvatar, meaning that they would get an afterlife, and they would join the men and the hobbits wherever it is that they go. And finally, final question, are the Valar just the top 15 most powerful Ainur, or are they intrinsically different than the Maiar? They are indeed, as you put it, the top 15 Ainur, though I don't think the word powerful is very correct. The words that Tolkien used were to describe the Valar were the greatest and the most fair. And I'm going to read a little bit of the Silmarillion here for you. Thus it came to pass that of the Ainur some abode still with Iluvatar beyond the confines of the world, but others, and among them many of the greatest and most fair, took leave of Iluvatar and descended into it. But this condition Iluvatar made, or it is the necessity of their love, that their power should thenceforth be contained and bounded in the world, to be within it forever, until it is complete, so that they are its life, and it is theirs. And therefore they are named the Valar, the powers of the world. So the Valar were the greatest and the fairest of the Ainur. They became the powers, which in Quenya becomes Valar. This doesn't mean that they're the most powerful, but that they power the world. That's what it means. They're the greatest and the fairest of the angels. There is even speaking of power, there is a subgroup of Valar, which is called the Aratar. Those are the most powerful. There's 8 of them, right? And the Maiar were of the same kind as the Valar, but of a lesser power, so they were not as powerful as the Valar. But what should be understood is that the Valar were given... The title of Valar was given only to the greatest and the most fair, while greatness could imply strength. It could also imply stature or bearing, and of course... fairness applies mostly to beauty, grace, and wisdom. So, all right, guys, that was everything, and I hope you learned a lot. I hope you had a good time watching the video. Definitely subscribe if you haven't already. Leave me some comments, hit the thumbs up, the bell, and all that usual YouTube stuff, and follow the link in the description to my core account and ask me some questions, and I'll see you guys next week. Oh, and I'm working on some other videos for this channel that aren't question related, which will pop up here and there, so be on the lookout for those as well.